Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, bathed in soft golden light as the sun rose over rolling fields. The Yoder farm stood quietly at the edge of the valley, its white clapboard house framed by the pale bloom of spring apple trees and a freshly painted red barn. It was April 4, 1992, a Saturday like any other in the tight-knit Amish community. Jacob Yoder, a stern but fair man of 42, was known for his early rising and diligent work ethic. He and his wife, Mary, had 4 children: Eli, 13, Ruth, 11, and the twins, Samuel and Sarah, only 7. Together, they lived a simple, honest life, no electricity, no modern distractions, just faith, family, and farming. That morning, their nearest neighbors, the Millers, noticed something peculiar as they passed by on their way to the market. The Yoder's horse-drawn buggy remained tied up outside the barn, untouched. The barn doors were half open, swaying slightly in the breeze, but no sound came from within, no hammering, no singing, not even the quiet shuffle of boots on hay. That alone wasn't entirely strange. But then Mrs. Miller saw something that unsettled her deeply. 2 loaves of bread, perfectly golden and fresh, sat cooling on the open windowsill. Next to them, a pitcher of goat's milk left out in the sun. It looked as if breakfast had just ended, or had never begun. Hours passed. No one saw the children running in the fields, no laundry flapping on the line, no sign of the Yoders at worship. By sunset, several neighbors had gathered, calling out politely from the fence line, as custom dictated. When no answer came, they approached the home, and what they found inside would echo through the community for years. The lamps were unlit, the room silent. Meals were half prepared, chairs slightly pulled back from the table. Jacob's hat still hung on the peg. Mary's shawl was draped across a rocking chair that gently rocked back and forth, though there was no wind in the room. The house was untouched by chaos, but hollow, like the family had simply evaporated into thin air. Sheriff Tom Granger arrived at the Yoder farm just after dawn the following day. A seasoned officer in his late 50s, Tom had spent most of his life dealing with small-town troubles, livestock disputes, minor thefts, the occasional runaway teen, not full-blown disappearances. Especially not from a family as respected and insulated as the Yoders. He parked his cruiser just outside the property, careful not to disturb anything. A cluster of neighbors stood near the barn in uneasy silence, hats in hand, eyes lowered, as though they had just left a funeral. None of them had entered the house past the front room. Out of respect for the family and their beliefs, they had waited for him. Tom stepped onto the porch, noting how the front door stood slightly ajar, not forced, not broken, just open. Inside, the air felt strangely heavy. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and yeast, the remnants of the morning's untouched meal still present on the stove. Plates were set neatly on the table, one of the mugs still warm to the touch. On the counter sat a hand-written list in Mary's careful script: churn butter, mend Eli's shirt, gather eggs, prepare for Sunday gathering. Ordinary, routine tasks, never completed. The sheriff's boots echoed softly against the wooden floorboards as he moved room to room. In the children's bedroom, he saw 4 small beds made with meticulous care, quilts pulled tight, pillows fluffed. But Ruth's favorite doll was left lying on the floor by the window, its face turned toward the glass as if watching for someone who never came. In the parents' room, a small oil lamp had burned itself out on the nightstand. Jacob's prayer book was left open beside it. But what caught Tom's attention most was the large family Bible on the dining table. It had clearly been in use, its worn spine cracked from daily readings. But the final page, the one where Jacob had been recording births and blessings, had been torn out, clean and precise, as if someone had deliberately removed their names from memory. No signs of struggle. No blood. No broken furniture or panicked scribbles. Just an eerie stillness, like the entire Yoder family had simply stood up in the middle of their day and walked out of existence. In the weeks following the Yoder family's disappearance, the tight-knit Amish community of Lancaster County became a place of hushed whispers and long stares. At first, neighbors hoped the family had simply traveled to visit distant relatives or left temporarily for reasons they hadn't disclosed. But as days turned to weeks with no word, hope slowly shifted into quiet dread. The Amish, known for their privacy and resilience, rarely spoke to outsiders, and certainly not to the press, but even their silent gazes spoke volumes. Something felt wrong, not just strange, but deeply, spiritually unsettling. Sheriff Granger made efforts to investigate, but quickly ran into obstacles. The Amish community, wary of law enforcement and fiercely protective of their way of life, offered little assistance. Not out of defiance, but out of tradition and fear. Some believed speaking too freely might invite danger, or worse, divine judgment. Others, especially the elders, dismissed the notion of foul play entirely, insisting the Yoders may have chosen to separate themselves even further from modern life, perhaps joining a more isolated sect in another state or moving deeper into the countryside. But there were no signs of departure, no clothes taken, no travel arrangements, no messages left behind. Their buggy and horses remained untouched. The family's savings, kept in a small lockbox under the kitchen floorboards, was still there, unopened. Among the younger Amish, a different narrative began to take shape. Whispers of a shadow seen near the Yoder barn late at night. A few children claimed to have heard strange knocking sounds in the trees or seen lantern lights in the woods when no one should have been there. Most dismissed it as superstition, but in a community steeped in folklore, the tales grew legs. One story that resurfaced was about Der Dunkel Man, the Dark Man, a figure parents once used to frighten misbehaving children, said to snatch away those who strayed too far from the path. It had long been relegated to bedtime warnings, but now, some wondered if there was more to it than myth. Journalists caught wind of the case and tried to intervene, but the Amish elders refused all interviews. The Yoder property was left as it was, frozen in time. Months later, wildflowers grew along the porch, and ivy crept up the barn. No one moved in. No one mowed the lawn. The home became a quiet monument to absence. By the end of the year, with no new leads and no fresh evidence, the case file was quietly closed. Sheriff Granger, frustrated and haunted, kept a copy of the torn Bible page in his drawer, staring at it on sleepless nights. The town tried to move on. But the Yoders had vanished without a trace, and the silence left behind was louder than anyone cared to admit. 10 years passed. The Yoder farm slowly surrendered to time, nature creeping back in to claim what had once been bustling with life. The white paint peeled from the clapboard siding, the barn's once sturdy beams began to sag, and vines overtook the front porch railing. Locals rarely spoke of the place anymore, though no one dared move into it. Most said it was out of respect. Others admitted quietly that the land simply didn't feel right. There was a heaviness there, not frightening exactly, but oppressive. The kind of quiet that makes even birds hesitate. In the spring of 2002, the neighboring Stoltzfus family hosted a barn raising for their son's upcoming wedding. It brought dozens of community members together, carpenters, blacksmiths, and farmers, young and old. Laughter echoed through the valley, and for a moment, the unease surrounding the Yoder mystery faded into the background. As the work paused for lunch, a few of the older men sat on crates beneath a maple tree, sharing stories of past raisings. That's when Levi Brenman, a retired carpenter with fading eyesight and a memory like steel, spoke up. "You know," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "they never did look through that old Yoder barn proper." "Not really." The others glanced at each other, unsure whether to entertain the thought or let it pass. "We honored the family's space," one replied cautiously. "Didn't seem right to go poking around." Levi leaned forward. "I remember helping Jacob frame that barn in '79. He built a double loft. Said he wanted to keep the hay dry, but the second level had a false wall, not wide enough to store anything practical. Always struck me as strange." By that evening, talk had spread to the new owner of the Yoder property, a man from out of town who had purchased it but never had the time or will to restore it. Curious, and eager to finally put rumors to rest, he granted permission for a small group to inspect the barn. It was the first time in a decade that anyone had stepped through those old wooden doors with real intent. Inside, the barn smelled of dry rot and mouse nests. Dust floated in the golden beams of sunlight pouring through the slats. Everything was still, almost too still. As Levi guided them toward the north wall, he tapped along the boards with his cane, listening for changes in the hollow thud of aged wood. Then, a sound, a different tone, a space behind the wall. Carefully, the group pried away a loose plank and revealed something unexpected, a narrow crawl space behind a thick layer of hay bales stacked intentionally to conceal it. Flashlights flickered on. Behind the wall was a wooden door, weathered and latched from the outside. When opened, it revealed a narrow stairway leading downward, not into the barn's foundation as expected, but into darkness no one had known existed. The air was cooler, stale, and thick with the scent of old dirt and forgotten things. No one spoke. They simply stared into the darkness, into the secret that had hidden there for 10 long years, waiting to be found. The stairs creaked underfoot as the group descended into the hidden passage, each step swallowed by the heavy darkness pressing in around them. The beam of Levi's flashlight flickered slightly as dust particles danced through the stagnant air. The space beneath the barn wasn't just a root cellar, it was far more than anyone had expected. It felt older, deeper, almost deliberately carved out and reinforced. The walls were rough stone, likely hand-dug and fortified with wooden supports that bowed slightly from the weight above. As they reached the bottom, the silence grew unnerving. No rats, no dripping water, no wind. Just a dense, breathless stillness. The cellar opened into a cramped chamber, no more than 15 feet wide. On one end sat a rocking chair, worn smooth along the arms. A thin layer of dust covered the seat, but not enough to hide the indentation. Someone had sat there frequently, for long periods. Across from it, lined carefully along the wall, were 6 wool coats, child-sized, hung on wooden pegs. Each was handcrafted in typical Amish fashion, with no buttons, only hooks and ties. Beneath them, pairs of children's shoes had been neatly placed side by side, as if awaiting their owner's return. In the center of the floor sat a rusted tin lantern in a small wooden box. Inside the box were melted candle stubs, a few pencil shavings, and what looked like old scraps of parchment with faded scripture passages. But it was the far wall that drew everyone's attention. Etched into the stone was a jagged inscription, the letters uneven and hurried, as if scratched with a nail or broken tool, "We hide from the evil above." The words stopped everyone cold. They searched the space carefully, but found no bones, no belongings beyond those few unsettling remnants. Whoever had stayed here, whether for days or years, had vanished just as thoroughly as they had from the house above. Yet it was clear the family hadn't been abducted in some chaotic, violent event. They had chosen to come down here. They had prepared. And they had left the outside world behind willingly. But why? Levi turned slowly, running his hand across the stone wall. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was thin. This ain't no storm shelter. This was a refuge. They weren't hiding from nature. They were hiding from something else. No one responded. The truth hung heavy in the stale air. They climbed back up the stairs in silence, each haunted by the image of those tiny shoes and the question that now loomed larger than ever. What had terrified the Yoders so much that they had buried themselves beneath their own barn? And more chilling still, where had they gone next? Several weeks passed after the discovery of the hidden cellar beneath the Yoder barn, but no new leads surfaced. The unearthed room only deepened the mystery, casting long shadows over a case that had already haunted the community for a decade. Most believed the trail had gone cold again. But then, in the most unexpected way, something, or someone, stirred the silence. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Miriam Zook, a soft-spoken Amish woman in her 60s, entered the general store in bird in hand to collect a special order of quilting thread. As she waited at the counter, her eyes wandered across the cluttered bulletin board behind the register. Pinned among outdated flyers and community notices was a black and white photograph taken earlier that year, a panoramic shot of the spring charity auction, capturing over 100 local families gathered in the town square. Miriam's gaze passed over the faces with casual interest until it abruptly froze. She leaned in closer. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her hand trembled as she pointed at the far right corner of the image, where the background blurred into the trees. There, partially obscured behind a group of younger men, was a tall figure in traditional Amish garb, wide-brimmed hat, long coat, but with something off. The boots. Heavy, scuffed leather work boots. Not the soft-soled black shoes Amish men wore. And his posture wasn't quite right either, stiff, guarded. His face was angled away, but enough was visible for Miriam's heart to drop. "That," she whispered to the shopkeeper, "looks like Jacob Yoder." The name alone was enough to stop the store owner cold. He pulled the photo from the board, squinting at the corner. "Could just be someone who looks like him," he offered, but not convincingly. The resemblance was uncanny. And more than that, the figure was clearly avoiding the camera, tucked behind others as if deliberately trying not to be seen. Word spread fast. A few others who had attended the auction confirmed they'd seen a tall man keeping to the fringes that day. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't bid on anything, hadn't even stayed long. Just hovered, watching, then disappeared before anyone could engage him. Miriam returned home shaken. That night, she dug through an old wooden chest where she'd kept a Yoder family photo taken in 1991, one of the few pictures in circulation, taken by an outsider before the family had fully turned away from outside contact. Holding the store photo beside it, she stared for hours. The line of the jaw, the shape of the ears, the slight slouch in the shoulders. She would stake her life on it. It was Jacob. But what chilled her more was the expression in his eyes, or rather, the absence of any warmth at all. Why had he returned only to remain hidden? What was he watching for? And if Jacob Yoder was alive, where was the rest of his family? The questions now screamed louder than ever, with a silent figure in a photograph reawakening a decade-old mystery, and hinting that the truth was not buried, but walking quietly among them. The strange photograph of the man who looked like Jacob Yoder spread quietly but quickly through the rural backroads and dirt paths of Lancaster County. Though no formal investigation was launched, the Amish preferred matters to be handled within. The renewed curiosity sparked something long buried in the mind of an aging man who had, for years, kept his silence. Walter Jenkins was a retired delivery driver, known for hauling dry goods and farming supplies to isolated parts of the countryside. He wasn't Amish, but he'd served the region for most of his life and was one of the few English the community tolerated, largely because he kept to himself and asked no questions. For a decade, he'd told no one about the odd delivery route he maintained from 1993 to 1998. There was no official address. No signature on receipts. Just a dirt road leading deep into a patch of state-owned forest land and a stack of boxes dropped near a large, flat rock. Walter had always thought it was strange. The first time he'd gotten the request, via a hand-delivered envelope left at the feed store, he thought it was a joke. Inside was a simple list: candles, wool yarn, matches, oats, dried milk, black ink, and handmade soap. No modern products, nothing processed, always in cash. The envelope had contained exact payment, to the cent. There was also a hand-drawn map. Curious but not concerned, he made the drop. When he returned a week later, the goods were gone, and another envelope sat under the same rock. He continued the arrangement every other week for nearly 5 years. He never saw a soul. Sometimes, the envelopes contained polite notes thanking him, sometimes more money, sometimes short scripture verses. But one particular note had always unsettled him. He kept it, tucked in a drawer all those years, though he never understood why, until now. Written in elegant, precise handwriting were the words: "We live, but we do not return. Not until it is safe for them." When Walter saw the photo pinned behind the register at the general store, the man half hidden in the crowd, a cold certainty washed over him. It was the same man who'd signed the notes, J.Y. He was sure of it. The eyes, even in black and white, were unmistakable. He decided, finally, to speak. He took the note and went to visit Bishop Reuben, one of the oldest and most respected leaders in the community. The bishop read the note in silence, then stared out the window for a long time. Finally, he spoke. There were whispers back then. Some believed the Yoders left to protect their children from something that couldn't be spoken of, not even in prayer. Walter asked him what could have driven an entire family underground. The bishop didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into a wooden cabinet and pulled out an old journal. He turned to a page and slid it across the table. On it was a drawing, a tall figure in a black hat, its eyes marked as deep pits of darkness. "The children called it the Watcher in the Trees," he said softly. "It appears when rules are broken. When lines are crossed." Walter left the house shaken, the note now feeling like a confession from a ghost. If the Yoders had survived all these years in hiding, what had they been running from? And what had changed now to bring Jacob, or someone like him, out of the shadows? One thing was clear: the story wasn't over. It was only now beginning to unfold. The woods were thick with mist as Sheriff Granger followed the path sketched out by Walter Jenkins. It had been more than a decade since he'd closed the Yoder file, convinced the case had reached a dead end. But the hidden cellar, the photograph, and now the delivery driver's confession had changed everything. Despite retirement looming just months away, He felt an obligation, no, a pull, to see the mystery through. Walter had drawn him a crude map based on memory, leading miles past the county line, into a stretch of old-growth forest where even game trails seemed to vanish. The deeper Tom went, the quieter everything became, the birdsong falling away until only the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots remained. After nearly an hour, he found it. The cabin was nearly swallowed by the trees. Small, made of dark timber, and sunken slightly into the earth, it looked like it had been built to disappear. Ivy climbed its sides, and moss grew thick on the slanted roof. There were no windows, only a narrow door and a rusted stovepipe poking from the top. What struck Tom immediately was the stillness, not just the absence of people, but the absence of presence. It felt as if someone had left moments ago, or had been watching for hours. He approached cautiously, announcing himself out of habit. No answer. The door creaked open with little effort. Inside, the cabin was stripped bare, no bedding, no food, no signs of current habitation. But the dust patterns told another story. A circle of floorboards had been recently disturbed, as if something large had been dragged out. The air smelled faintly of wax and wood smoke. Then Tom noticed the hatch. It was hidden beneath a straw mat near the fireplace. He lifted it slowly and shone his flashlight into the darkness. No steps, just a short drop into a crawlspace. He lowered himself in and found a narrow tunnel, no wider than a closet. He crawled a few feet forward and found a small cache of belongings. Children's drawings, a wooden whistle, and a bundle of letters wrapped in waxed cloth. But it was the drawings that chilled him most. One depicted a crude figure standing under a tree, tall, with long arms, and hollow eyes. Another showed a family huddled underground, with the same figure looming above their cabin. Scribbled in shaky handwriting along the bottom of the paper were the words, "He waits until we leave." Tom backed out slowly, heart pounding. The letters were brittle, dated from the late 90s, and all signed, Mary Yoder. They weren't addressed to anyone, but read more like diary entries. Samuel is getting sick again. The darkness comes closer every night. Jacob says we have no choice but to move again. In one of the last entries, she wrote, "If anyone finds this, we are not dead. We are hiding. We must hide." He watches the house. He watches the woods. He watches the children. Tom left the cabin with the letters, knowing what he had was fragile, yet undeniable proof that the Yoders had been alive, maybe even for years after they vanished. And more disturbingly, they had not been alone. Back in town, when the bishop read the letters, he said only one thing: they didn't leave because they lost faith. They left because they believed something had taken root in the land, something that could not be fought, only outrun. But if Jacob had been seen recently, walking among the people, it begged a final question. Had they outrun it, or had it followed them back?